This week's blog post is the fifth in my series on the St. Gaudens National Historical Park in Cornish, New Hampshire. For more on the park, see the first post in this series. In 1948, 2 decades after St. Gaudens' home had become a museum, 2 of the site's outbuildings were remodeled into exhibition galleries. At their center is a courtyard in the Roman style with an atrium and pool. This post is the first of 2 on the sculptures that are in the new gallery. And the sculpture you see in the distance and on the right is Amor Caritas. It's a classically draped winged figure holding aloft a plaque with the words Amor Caritas, love and charity. St. Gaudens' model for the figure was David Clark, on whom you can see one of the other posts in this series. Amor Caritas won the grand prize at the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1900. St. Gaudens sold about 20 reduced-size copies of the work at Tiffany's and elsewhere, which is why the Metropolitan and many other museums have copies of it. St. Gaudens created 100 or so portraits in exquisite low relief. He was trained as a cameo maker when he was a teenager. We've already seen some of them in the little studio. These are a few of those. This post contains portraits of some of his close family and friends. If you're wondering why I keep posting photos of these portraits, I've always found it very relaxing to look at the work of people who are highly competent, be they artists, engineers, dentists, or whatever. Looking at the variety of conception and the skill of execution of portraits by St. Gaudens is both soothing and energizing to me. So, the first of the sculptures in the new gallery. This is Bernard P.E. St. Gaudens. It was done in 1867. It is a bust by St. Gaudens of his father, and it was one of his earliest works. Next up, the Beeman family. On the left is Charles Cotesworth Beeman. This one was done in 1894. Beeman, 1840 to 1900, a graduate of Harvard Law, became the first ever Solicitor General of the U.S. in 1870. His task was to handle claims of losses to Confederate privateers during the Civil War. In the summer of 1885, Beeman rented an old inn to Augustus St. Gaudens, who purchased the property a few years later in 1892. Charles's wife was Hetty. She was the daughter of Senator William Maxwell Everts, whom we'll see in a few minutes. And on the right is William Everts Beeman, 1885. Willie, 1881 to 1945, was almost the same age as St. Gaudens' son Homer. There's a portrait of him a few posts back. St. Gaudens sculpted this portrait as payment to Charles and Hetty Beeman for the rental of the Cornish property in the first summer that St. Gaudens and his family spent there. It's worth noting that many portraitists are good at one type of person or another. St. Gaudens does wonderful portraits of all ages and all types. Next up is William Maxwell Everts. The one on the left is 1873 or 74. The one on the right is 1887. Everts, whose dates are 1818 to 1901, was one of St. Gaudens' earliest patrons. When St. Gaudens sculpted the portrait on the left, Everts had already served as U.S. Attorney General in 1868 to 69 under Andrew Johnson. The original of this bust was in marble. This is a later bronze cast. I really like this man's cheekbones. The relief portrait on the right was done in 1887. By this time, Everts had served as U.S. Secretary of State from 1877 to 81 under Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was serving at the time as Senator from New York, which he did from 1885 to 1891. Next up, the Schiff children. If you're on my Sunday recommendations list, you've seen this recently. Jacob H. Schiff, 1847 to 1920, an immigrant from Germany, became a prominent banker at the New York firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, where he funded the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War and also funded several American railroads. He was a major donor to Jewish charities in the U.S. and a leader of the Jewish community from 1880 to 1920. Schiff's estate was about $50 million, which would be $760 million or so today. He was succeeded at Kuhn Loeb by his son Mortimer Leo Schiff, who appears here as an 8-year-old. The relief was commissioned from St. Gaudens in 1885. According to a label at the St. Gaudens National Historical Site, the deerhound in the image here belonged not to the Schiffs but to St. Gaudens. In 1905, Jacob Schiff paid for a marble replica for the Metropolitan Museum's collection. This bronze original was donated to the St. Gaudens National Historical Park by a descendant of the Schiffs. The workmanship on this is just lovely. On the left, barely visible, Violet Sargent, 1890. This is the sister of painter John Singer Sargent, and she is playing a guitar. On the right is Bessie Smith White. The original was probably around 1884. Bessie was the wife of noted architect Stanford White, who often collaborated with St. Gaudens on projects. On the left is Anna Lemon Gray. This was done around 1902-4. Anna was the wife of John Chapman Gray, who was a professor of law at Harvard. I really like the line of her back. And finally, on the right, this is Augusta Homer St. Gaudens, St. Gaudens' wife. This was the last relief that St. Gaudens executed. He died in 1907. Next week we will see more sculptures from the new gallery. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the free Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.